I can still smell the old oil on my hands, and the way the cold metal stung my knuckles when the wrench slipped. There's a time of night when the town goes quiet except for the trains and your own heartbeat, and that's when I worked under a flickering bulb in Grandpa's garage, bent over a faded blue F-100 that everyone swore was worth less than the rust blooming on it. They'd come by and tip their chins toward the door, just enough to say they were only curious, only passing through, before letting out those soft, amused laughs. Why fix that old rust? Someone would say, and someone else would whistle like it was a joke that would never get old. I kept my head down and turned the socket again, because if I looked up, I knew how my face would look, and I didn't want to give them that satisfaction. My grandfather had called her Ellen the truck, as if naming a ship. He'd bought her new in 1966, long before I existed, long before my mother stopped talking to him for reasons I only half knew. I remember the first time he sat me in the passenger seat when I was 8 and drove a slow loop around the block, a tobacco tin rattling in the glovebox and the windows down even though the heater made the cab smell like dust and copper pennies. When he passed, the truck sat in the lean-to at the side of the house, tarped, a washed-out shoulder at the edge of our lives. Nobody wanted the thing. My Uncle Don wanted the space. It's a rat hotel, he said, jabbing a finger at the tarp like there was a lawsuit curled up beneath it. I could have let it be. But the last week Grandpa was in hospice, he squeezed my hand and said, almost to himself, a man ought to leave one thing better than he found it. And the only thing I could think of was Ellen. I hauled the tarp off in early spring and saw what I'd promised myself. The hood fought me, everything fought me, honestly. The fuel turned to varnish, and the carburetor gummed like old honey. The ignition points were pitted into ash. When I finally got the valve cover off, I found one of the pushrods bowed like a kid's straw. I ordered parts from a stranger on a message board in Kentucky, who mailed them in a shoebox with good luck, written in Sharpie inside the lid. Night after night, I scraped my knuckles on seized bolts and taught myself the feel of a torque wrench, the way you learn a person's moods. I kept Grandpa's geared Chilton manual open on the workbench, pages slicked with years of fingerprints. I kept a coffee can for the screws and clips and saved every one, counting them back like a rosary before I turned off the light. People love to watch you try something they don't believe you can finish. They love it the way they love the last seconds of a boxing match when someone looks like they might stand back up. My cousin Blake came by in his clean boots and gave me a smile just this side of kind. "Looks like you're getting somewhere," he said, spinning a socket between his fingers. "Any idea what somewhere pays these days?" I didn't answer, and he leaned in toward the engine bay like a tourist at a museum. "You know Don's called a tow company twice, right? Told them there's a junker here he'll pay to have hauled." He paused to let me ask who stopped them. "Aunt Lena told them to talk to you," he said finally, like the sensible one in the room had also decided I was a waste of time. After he left, I stood in the doorway and watched dust settle through sunlight and thought about quitting just so the silence wouldn't feel like a verdict. Mara came by a few times at the beginning, careful with her steps on the gravel, hair tied back like she didn't want to pick up the smell of old gas. She leaned on the fender and asked me what I was doing like it was charming, like I was the kid who'd taken apart a clock and could show her the gears. "We could be going to the coast," she said, fingers tapping an idle rhythm on the paint. When I didn't answer, she pinched my ear like she used to when we were 16. "6 months ago, you were looking for a job with benefits," she said. "Now you're married to a Ford." After that, she texted less, and when she did, it was mostly pictures of places I had said I wanted to see someday, hiking trails, shops she would stand in front of, pointing at a coat I'd admired once. The last text from her said, "I can't wait around forever, you know." And I put my phone face down and wiped my hands again, even though I'd just washed them. The first real betrayal was smaller than a word. One night, I came out to find the lean-to door open and the bulb out. Someone had taken the new cap and rotor off the bench. Not the whole box, just those two, just enough to stall me. I checked the locks twice after that and kept my tools in the truck bed under a tarp, slept badly, and dreamed about someone's hand reaching in where it didn't belong. The next morning, I saw the toe of a boot print in the dust by the shelf, the sole thinly worn, a little piece missing near the heel that looked exactly like the pair Blake wore when he stood back there and smiled like he was being helpful. I told myself not to make a thing of it. I told myself a lot of things. I'd been working 3 weeks straight when the tow notice came from the city. White paper, perfect block letters, abandoned vehicle, with a date circled 2 weeks out. I held it in both hands and felt the pulse in my fingertips. Aunt Lena was in the kitchen, trying to make coffee taste like it wasn't a week old. "I'll talk to them," she said without looking at me, "or you could just let it go." The way she said it made me think she wanted me to say yes, so she wouldn't have to keep watching me fail in slow motion. "It was his," I said, and she put the mug down too hard and flinched at her own noise. "I know," she said. "I know whose it was." Every night after that I made lists, things to check, things I had checked that somehow didn't matter. Fuel, spark, compression. I replaced the fuel line and blew air through it until my ears rang. I adjusted the valves until I could feel each one move like a living thing. I traced every wire until the backs of my eyes ached. I bought a cheap timing light and set it on the radiator with the trigger zip, tied back, watching it blink like a heartbeat. I liked the way the light made the metal look clean, the way a hospital room makes you believe in the possibility of survival. When I ran out of things to replace, I sanded the valve cover and painted it a careful black so that it wouldn't embarrass the engine when it finally decided to live again. Around midnight, the trains were far enough away that you could hear the mice. Sometimes, to keep myself from listening, I would talk to the engine. "What do you want?" I'd ask, like it could tell me, like it hadn't been telling me for weeks, and I was the one who didn't want to hear it. I started to think about Grand. The way you think about people who are gone but not really, not when you're doing the thing they set in motion. He had big hands and scars on his forearms from machining parts for a company whose name I never could remember. He'd slide his thumb under my wrist when I was little and say, "Steady," as if it were a command you could give your own body and trust it to obey. In my head, I started saying it to myself when the bolts wouldn't break, when I realized a mistake I didn't know how to fix, when I saw the tow notice taped again to the door with a new circle around a date too close to breathe near. On a Sunday, Uncle Don brought over a man in a polo shirt who walked around the yard with a little notebook and the polite tone people use when they've already decided how the conversation ends. "We can have it gone by Friday," the man said, seeing me as a speed bump, not a human title. He asked, and Don tipped his head toward me as if to say, "There's your problem." "No title," Don said. "He doesn't even have the key. He has an old key to the house and a box of junk parts." He smiled at that like he'd made a joke at a company picnic. I felt the space behind my ribs go cold the way it does before a migraine, as if the nervous system needed a warning. After they left, I went to the closet in the back bedroom and pulled down the shoebox Grandpa had left me. The one with the key he'd told me goes to the only thing that ever took me out of here. I had held that key 100 times, tracing the shape of its teeth with my thumb. It had the tiny stamped script F on the head, worn smooth in the center where a thumb had lived for decades. I had it, I'd always had it, but Don liked saying I didn't like he liked air. My days got smaller, up at 6, work until the cents fell out of decisions. An old man at the parts store named Walt taught me how to gap spark plugs with the feel of pressure on a dime. He shook his head at my list and told me to change the condenser even if it looked fine, because sometimes they just die because they want to. Some things got personality, he said, looking past me at a wall of belts. You treat them like they don't, they'll prove you wrong at the worst moment. I didn't tell him I'd started talking to a machine. The second betrayal was not a theft. It was worse. Screen while Aunt Lena to spokes to someone on the phonar, the kind of TRANW. HISPS SUFORM, it, from ATHINK is Jullal, a whisper until you realize it's meant to be heard. He's stuck. She was saying. He puts everything into that truck because it's easier than putting it into himself. There was a pause. No, he's not like Don. He won't quit if you humiliate him. He'll just get quieter. Her voice cracked when she said it, and she added, I'm tired. And in that moment I was not angry. I was just emptied out, the way a lake looks when the wind takes the surface away. That was the same night I heard a metallic scrape, the sound of someone testing a lock. I got up with the wrench still in my hand, walked around the corner, and caught a figure at the garage door. The motion of him was familiar before the face was. Blake's shoulders rounded like he was cold. When his head lifted and he saw me, the chin went up again to that angle that asked to be forgiven before it admitted anything. You scared me, he said, as if I had done the sneaking. Don said to grab the toolbox. He needs the half-inch drive. He was wearing those boots. The tiny notch near the heel stared up at me like a confession that had gone stale. The tools are Grandpa's, I said. They stay here. He shrugged, went for the friendly smile. You're not the only one who needs things, he said, and when I didn't move, he put his hands in his pockets and went home like nothing had happened. The engine was ready in all the ways an engine can be ready and still refuse you. Sometimes I'd sit in the cab just to hold the steering wheel and imagine the noise. My hand would find the worn groove where Grandpa's ring had bitten over the years, and I'd feel a ghost of him there, steady. The seat springs creaked their old complaint. The smell of mice came and went. I pulled the headliner down and vacuumed nests that made my skin crawl. I cut a piece of carpet to fit and tucked it in while telling myself that making something warmer before it was alive wasn't a mistake. It was a promise. I left the glovebox alone because it stuck, and I didn't want to break something just to satisfy a will I didn't trust. The latch would jiggle and then hold like a hand you couldn't get out of. The inciting incident, the one that broke the rhythm I'd worn like prayer beads, came the morning the tow truck backed into our drive like a slow, sure decision. Friday, the date circled. A man in a neon vest hopped down with the air of someone who loved his job on days when people didn't fight him. Aunt Lena stepped out onto the porch and crossed her arms because she didn't know what else to do with them. I stood in the doorway of the garage with a socket in my hand that suddenly looked absurd. A neighbor I barely knew leaned on his fence and watched, and 2 kids on bikes stopped at the corner because spectacle is free. That it? The driver asked, peering into the dim. I could feel the moment settle like a tone only I could hear. Not today, I said, not loud enough to be dramatic, just loud enough to be clear. The driver sighed the polite kind of sigh that says everything you want me to do means paperwork for me, and he raised his hands. Look, I don't care, he said. I just do what people pay me to do. If it starts, it stays. He hooked his thumb at the sky where the weather was thinking about rain. Got 5 minutes. He added, "After that, my boss calls your neighbor who called us and tells him I failed." I don't remember crossing the floor, only being inside the cab with the key in my fist and a sense that everyone's breathing had synchronized without anyone agreeing to it. I felt the teeth of the key slide into the ignition and a tiny click when the head met the face of the cylinder where it had been meeting it for half a century. My palms were slick. I wrapped the key ring around one finger. I looked at the driver and the neighbor and the kids, and Don at the edge of the yard with his arms folded like something he owned was being misused. "Come on," I said under my breath, and then I turned the key. There are sounds you could spend a lifetime describing and never get right. The first grind of the starter was more desperate than mechanical, a scraping plea. I let it spin long enough to feel silly and stopped, the silence collapsing back in around me like an insult. I pumped the pedal once, twice, the way Walt had told me, and tried again. The second time was different. There was a cough, like a smoker testing a morning, then a small, defiant bark. Something inside me stiffened in recognition. I could hear fuel where there had been only the idea of fuel. I tapped the gas gently, the way you do with a friend you're waking at a bad hour. "Come on, Ellen," I said, because if you are going to personify a machine in your head, you might as well do it out loud when it matters. On the third turn, the engine caught like a match in wind. There was a noise like a breath pulled the wrong way, then a throaty rumble that climbed, fell, and steadied, all in a handful of seconds that cracked open something in my chest I'd kept shut a long time. The whole truck shivered as vibration traveled every place my tools had touched. The valve cover I'd painted went from cold black to a kind of warm that made it look honest. The timing light I'd left on the radiator blinked in approval, each flash a separate joy. Exhaust pushed a little cloud out from the tailpipe, and the smell was rich and full of 1,000 molecules that all agreed. I was grinning like a fool and wiping at my face with the back of my wrist, surprised to find it wet when I hadn't thought of tears as part of this at all. There was a small voice then, the older kid on the bike. It started, he said, as if announcing a birth. The tow driver laughed once, not unkindly, tucked his clipboard under his arm, and saluted. "Guess I failed," he said, and then he was gone, backing down the drive with a practiced skill I couldn't begrudge him. I let the truck idle and reached out to rest my hand on the dash like you do with a dog that's done something good. I looked at Aunt Lena on the porch, and she was crying, too, quietly, hands uncrossed, one at her mouth like she didn't trust it. Don had gone from gray to a kind of pink that didn't flatter him. Blake wasn't anywhere I could see. I don't know what made me open the glove box. Maybe it was the way everything else had started to feel, as if it were answering a question I hadn't asked. Maybe it was seeing the latch in the dash's little vibration, the jiggle now more of a dance. I pressed the button and the door fell open with a gasp, spilling out a stink of old paper and the faintest hint of Grandpa's pipe tobacco, as if smell could cling to wax and time. A flattened tobacco tin slid out and clinked on my thigh. Inside it were 3 things bound together with a rubber band that had dissolved into stick. A photograph of Grandpa standing next to Ellen the day he bought her, a parking ticket from 1985 with a comment that read "Friendly Warning," and an envelope sealed with brown tape and the words "In case I forget," written in Grandpa's tight, machinist's hand. I held my breath without meaning to. The envelope impressed its edges into my fingers. I thought of the shoebox in the closet, and the way Grandpa had murmured, "Only thing that ever took me out of here." And I felt that same tone now, a private joke he had kept until it stopped being funny and became necessary. When I tore the tape, the paper made a sound like something being freed. Inside were 2 folded documents and a smaller sealed note with my name on it. The first document was a stock certificate, heavy paper with a fancy border like money, pretending to be a wedding invitation. Breyer and Locke Tools, Incorporated. It read, in a font that had believed in the future, 10,000 common shares issued to Earl A. Ramsay, my grandfather, signed in 1968. I blinked, thinking it had to be like Confederate money, romantic, valueless, a story. But stapled to it was a letter from 1999, bearing the name of a law firm I recognized even from their newsletters that came after the holidays to remind you might need them. The letter explained, in the dry-tone lawyers must learn somewhere, that Breyer and Locke had been acquired by Northline Defense that year, and while most shareholders had been converted through a brokerage, a handful of paper certificates had remained unimmobilized. The certificate could still be surrendered in exchange for Northline stock plus accumulated dividends, at a rate that made my stomach flip when I did the math even badly. Please contact us, the letter said. We have attempted to reach you at the address on file. Grandpa hadn't told them where he moved. He hadn't told anyone anything he didn't want to. The second document was a codicil to his will, a 1-page thing with a notary stamp I traced with my finger and a date 2 years before he died. It was simple. It left the truck to me, formally. It also did something else I couldn't translate until I read it again. It assigned the chose in action. A phrase I had to say out loud like it was a puzzle. Of any unclaimed certificate related to Breyer and Locke to me, upon restoration of the vehicle to running condition. I laughed the first time I read that part. It was a laugh like you make when you realize the trap you've walked in, was set by someone who loved you enough to know exactly how to bait it. The third piece, the small sealed note, was just 4 lines and a signature. If you're reading this, she's running, he wrote. A man ought to leave one thing better than he found it. I couldn't sell that paper, not after what it cost us. If you can make her run, you can figure the rest. I sat there with the engine humming around me, and felt the past slot into place like the teeth on the key. This was the midpoint where everything you think you know turns itself right side up. He hadn't been stubborn about the truck because he was sentimental. He'd been training me for this, shown me what it meant to sit with a thing long enough to make it tell you where it hurts. He'd hidden the stock because he was ashamed of the way it had come into his life. The company had laid off his men, and he'd been paid in paper that felt like apology. And he couldn't bring himself to touch it, but he also couldn't throw it away. He'd tucked it into the one place he trusted no one but me would ever respect. Don would never open a glovebox. He'd rather break the door. There was a sound outside, voices moving like weather. Don's boots on gravel. He had seen the envelope in my hand when I pulled it out, and even though he couldn't see what it was, he knew it mattered. "What's that?" he called, casual the way a man talks to a dog who may or may not come when called. I climbed out of the cab with the paper in my hand, and the shaking in my legs disguised by the rumble of the engine. The kids were gaping. The neighbor leaned farther on his fence, eyes bright in a way that told me he smelled a change. "Just the title," I said. I don't know why I said it. Maybe because the part of me that wanted to run this clean had woken up and was looking at me like a partner who expected me not to mess this up. Don stepped closer and held out a hand I had spent my childhood watching my mother not take. "We'll need that," he said, "so we can do this properly." Behind him, Blake filtered into view from somewhere to the right, wearing the expression men wear when they've chosen the winning side and need you to see them as magnanimous. I said, "I thought you wanted it gone." I couldn't help it. The mean part of me had a small, sharp beak, and it pecked. Aunt Lena came down the steps. "What's in the envelope?" she asked, no pretense. I handed her the codicil first. She read it, lips moving just at the edges, and her eyes flicked up to mine. The notary stamp seemed to do something to her spine, straighten it or soften it. I'm not sure which. She handed it back and held out her hand for the next, and I gave her the certificate. She didn't understand the border or the words, but she understood the weight and the stamp from the law firm attached. I could see the moment she realized it wasn't a prank or a certificate for a free ham. Don reached for it, and she pulled it just out of his reach, a movement so smooth and small it barely qualified as an action. This says it's his, she told him. Don smiled like a salesman denying a fact printed on paper. Everything of Earl's is family. He said, the old script, the one that told you how duty worked in houses like ours. We'll sort the legal later. I put the small note back into the envelope and slid it into my back pocket. The engine idled a little high, like it wanted to be in this conversation and didn't understand the etiquette. Grandpa assigned this to me, I said, holding the words like a tool I wasn't sure I knew how to use. It's contingent on the truck, which, if you can't hear, is running. Don opened his mouth to argue and found he didn't have the right nouns. You think I don't have a lawyer, he said, asking me if I believed in dragons because he had a map. I told him the law firm's name on the letter. You could see the recognition pass through him like a muscle spasm. They'll take your money, he said. They'll tell you whatever you want to hear until you run out. Justice isn't a switch. It's a rope you pull, and sometimes nothing comes, and sometimes the whole bell tower wakes up. The next morning, I called the number on the letter. I expected to be bounced between voice mailboxes, but a man picked up with a voice that sounded like it had been trained in rooms with thick carpet. When I gave him my grandfather's name, there was a pause, not the kind that meant he was confused, the kind that meant he was choosing words with care. We've been waiting a long time to hear from someone, he said. Can you bring the certificate in? He explained that the shares had, in fact, accumulated dividends held in trust, and that while a lot of things had to be verified, nothing in the documents was impossible. I told him about the codicil, and he asked me to bring that too. We'll want to get Mr. Ramsey's probate file, he said, and when I told him we'd already closed the estate, he made a noise halfway between surprise and relief. Good, he said, that will make some things easier. I didn't tell Don. I drove into town in Ellen, the sound of the engine a steadying hum that made even stoplights feel like an accomplishment. The receptionist looked up at me like I was a man bringing in a relic, and I guessed I was. The lawyer turned the certificate over like it might be counterfeit money and then laughed at himself. I never get tired of this, he said, not quite under his breath. He made copies and slid the originals back to me, his eyes careful. How much is this? I asked, because I was not going to pretend to be polite about the thing gnawing inside me. He typed a number into a calculator and turned it so I could see. It was more than our house and the yard and the lean-to combined, even if you added a best-case scenario for paint and memory. It felt like getting to the top of a hill and realizing what you'd been climbing wasn't a hill at all, but the slope of some enormous thing that had been called a hill only because nobody ever got to the top. By the time I got home, news had moved the way news moves on streets, where people have each other's numbers. Don was waiting with Blake on the porch, and the set of his shoulders made me think of a dog guarding something it had never owned but liked believing it had. You went behind our backs, he said, like there had been a back in which we shared anything but blood and houses that needed repairs. It belonged to Earl, I said, and I heard Grandpa's name in my mouth like a final exam. He left it to me. Blake stepped forward, eager. We helped, he said. We took care of him when nobody else did. We're owed. I remembered the missing distributor cap and rotor, and for a second the image of my hand around his collar burned itself into my vision. I let it pass. You took care of what you wanted. I said, now I'm taking care of what he wanted. That night, Aunt Lena sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and her tax binder. The papers fanned out like a bird that had decided against flight. He was ashamed, she said, not looking at me. That company, the layoffs, your mother never forgave him. She folded a receipt and unfolded it again. She thought the truck was penance, and he knew it. He couldn't put down either of them. Her eyes were tired, but not the kind of tired that makes you weak. The kind that makes you see. I can forgive him now, she said quietly, if you can. Forgiveness wasn't a thing I had considered. It was a flavor that wasn't on my tongue. But I thought of him with his big hands worrying a little box of paper he couldn't touch without feeling the faces of men who'd stood outside the factory with cups of bad coffee and anger growing like moss, and I felt something shift. Maybe that was the other inheritance, quieter but heavier. The ability to hold two truths, that he had done what he could and that it had cost others, that he had hidden paper in a glove box because he couldn't look at it, and that he had written my name on a note because he wanted me to decide what to do with what he couldn't carry. The law part didn't happen overnight. Verification took weeks, then more weeks. There were forms and notarized statements, and a clerk at the courthouse who remembered Grandpa as the man with the flashlight, which made me think of him in a new way I wasn't ready for. Don hired a lawyer of his own and filed an objection that read like someone trying to claim Rain as a personal asset. The judge read the codicil and the letter, and listened to everyone say the same things in slightly different words. She looked at me over her glasses and said, "You started the truck." And when I said yes, she smiled just a little in a way that made me think she had a story of her own about something people laughed at until it worked. She denied Don's petition and told him, in more legal words, to go home and stop wasting people's time. I didn't buy a new house. I didn't buy anything, not for a while. I got the truck registered in my name, got a proper title, and paid off the back taxes on the place so Aunt Lena could sleep. I bought a new garage door and a set of sockets that clicked into their tray with a sound that made something in me relax. I took Aunt Lena to the coast one weekend, the two of us eating chowder at a place where the windows rattled in the wind and everything smelled like ocean. She didn't say it, but I could feel her shifting in her chair like a teacher after a long exam, waiting to hand back the papers and finally breathe. Myra wrote once, I heard, she said, meaning the money, meaning the truck. Coffee. I stared at the word until it lost its edges. I wrote back to say I wasn't mad and that I hoped she got the coat. And then I put my phone face down like I had that night in the garage and let silence be what it had to be. People are good at returning when things look like they might be warm. I don't blame them for wanting heat. But I had built a fire out of something everyone said was wet, and I wanted to sit with it for a while. Sometimes at night, I sit in the cab with the engine off and the windows cracked and listen to the small house noises that come through. The dishwasher complaining, the neighbor's dog, the train. I keep the tobacco tin in the glove box, like he did, with the certificate now framed and locked in a safe, because I am not a person who trusts paper in tin. The note with my name on it I keep in my wallet. It's folded so many times that the crease has begun to let go, and I know someday I'll have to decide whether to tape it. I run the key on its ring with my finger and feel the notches like an old song. The cut pattern is a map if you let it be. The funny thing about all of it is how ordinary it looks from the street. A truck, a yard a little less wild, a man hosing dust out of a garage. If you didn't know, you'd think I was just killing time. But sometimes Mrs. Whittaker from 2 houses down will stop, grocery bag on her wrist, and say, "Your grandfather would have been proud." And then add, "Don't tell him I said that," like he might be doing laps around the block just to collect compliments. Pride is a tricky thing. It can blow up in your face like a poorly timed spark, but it can also settle over you like the evening after a good day's work, warm and earned. I still hear laughter sometimes in my head, like a radio station you can't quite tune out. The boys on their bikes grew into young men and shout my name when they pass, the tone different now, full of the kind of awe boys reserve for horsepower and winning. Don doesn't come by anymore. He sends cards at holidays with his name next to his wife's in ink that belongs to her, and that's fine. Blake waved at me in the grocery store last week, the wave of a man who isn't sure whether you will shake the hand he isn't offering, and I nodded like I was at peace. Justice didn't look like someone else losing everything. It looked like me choosing what to do with something hidden in a glove box by a man who didn't quite know how to talk to his daughter or his brother or anyone, really, about the way his life had unfolded. I sold half the stock and kept the rest, which felt like the right ratio of gratitude to caution. I set up a scholarship in his name at the community college for people going into machining, and when they asked me to write a paragraph for the program, I wrote, "A man ought to leave one thing better than he found it," and left it at that. On the day I took Ellen out on the highway for the first time, the sky was a high, clean blue that made the road look like a fresh mark on paper. She didn't like 65. She wanted 50, 5 and a conversation, and I gave it to her. The wind came through the wing windows, and the sound filled me up the way you drink water after a long shift, and feel it move into the empty places. I put my hand on the seat where the sun had warmed it and thought, this is the kind of story people think is about money. But the truth is, the money was a key to some doors I hadn't believed I'd get to open, and the truck was the key to all the rooms I didn't know were in me. They laughed when I started. They had reasons. They always do. I spent nights in that garage with no one helping and no one caring, not because I was noble, but because I was stubborn and because something in me recognized a promise even when I couldn't see it. The day the engine caught, I understood that the joke had never been on me. It had been a test of how long I could stand there with a key in my hand and not turn it out of anger, not out of fear, but out of faith that metal and time and a grandfather's quiet dare could still add up to a beginning. And when the glove box opened and the paper slid into my hand with the weight of an old story finally told, I realized there are some documents whose worth isn't just measured in what they buy, but in what they prove. I turned the key then, and I've been turning it ever since. The first night I bled on the wrench, I kept my hand under the cold tap until the water ran pink and clear, then went back out to the garage because the quiet after midnight is the only time a man can hear what a machine is trying to say. The bulb over the workbench flickered like a tired eyelid, painting the faded blue of Grandpa's F-100 in a weak halo. People had laughed when I dragged the tarp off it. Soft chuckles at the grocery store, a whistled, "Why fix that old rust?" From the sidewalk, a kindness disguised as advice from family who wanted the space more than they wanted the memory. I wiped my hands on a rag that smelled like gasoline and dust and put my shoulder into a bolt that hadn't moved since a president I'd only seen in textbooks was on television. The socket slipped. My knuckles kissed cast iron. The envelope impressed its edges into my fingers, and in that breath I saw Grandpa's hands in my head, big, scarred, steady, and heard him the way I always heard him when things wanted to break me, steady. I exhaled and tried again. He called the truck Ellen, like a woman he trusted with secrets. I used to think it was ridiculous to name a machine, but the first time he let me ride shotgun with the windows down and the heater blowing that burnt copper smell, I understood the way the steering wheel hummed under my palms and how the bench seat sighed like an old friend when we hit a bump. After he passed, the truck became a shoulder in the yard that no one would look at, tarped, unloved, not quite dead, not quite alive. Uncle Don wanted it gone so he could store a jet ski he'd never buy. Aunt Lena wanted the arguing to stop. My mother wanted to be anywhere but in the shadow of a man whose last years were a map of regrets. I didn't want any of it until the week before he died, when he squeezed my wrist with surprising strength and said, almost like a prayer he'd kept private, "A man ought to leave one thing better." Then he found it. He didn't say which thing. He didn't have to. The hood fought me. Everything fought me. Old gas had turned to varnish. The carb was glued with honey, amber sludge that smelled like a museum. Ignition points were pitted to ash. The fuel pump wheezed. A pushrod bowed like a cheap straw. I learned the weight and click of the torque wrench the way you learn the moods of someone you live with. I kept his dog-geared Chilton manual open on the bench, pages glossy with fingerprints ghosted there by other nights, other knuckles. I kept a coffee can for bolts and clips, and counted them like a rosary before I shut off the light, because losing one piece is how you teach chaos to take up residence. I made lists, fuel, spark, compression, things I understood, things I pretended to until I did. People love to be present for the beginning of a failure. Blake, my cousin, leaned on the doorjamb in clean boots that had never seen real work and spun a socket between his fingers like a coin trick. "Any idea what somewhere pays if you ever get there?" he asked, eyes shiny with friendly concern. Don called a tow company. He added, like weather, "Says he'll pay to haul the junk." He let that sit between us. A test of whether I'd bristle. I didn't. After he left, I stood in the doorway and watched dust find places to land in the rectangle of sunlight, and thought about quitting just so the silence would stop sounding like a verdict. Mara came by in the early weeks, careful on the gravel, hair pulled back like she didn't want the smell of old gas in it. "We could be at the coast," she said, tapping a rhythm on the fender with 2 fingers, the way she did when a song she liked was stuck in her head. "6 months ago you were looking for a job with health insurance. Now you're married to a Ford." I loved her enough to hear the reason under the complaint. She was afraid of standing still. I told her I'd be done soon. The kind of lie people tell when they're trying to keep 2 promises that don't fit in the same day. The last text she sent said, "I can't wait around forever." I put my phone face down and wiped my hands again, even though I'd already washed them, as if I could scrub off the part of me that understood her and still chose the truck. The first betrayal was smaller than a word. One night I came out to the garage, and the lean-to door was cracked, bulb dead, a dark throat where light should have been. The new distributor cap and rotor, just those were gone from the bench. Not the box, not the old parts. Just enough to stall me, to make me feel watched. In the dust by the shelf, a single boot print with a notch missing near the heel, exactly like the pair Blake wore when he dropped by to smile and offer help that never ripened into action. I told myself not to make a thing of it. I told myself a lot of things. A white notice arrived taped to the garage door with the city's crisp block letters. Abandoned vehicle. Tow authorized on the 15th. 2 weeks. Aunt Lena raided at the sink and set it down like it might bite. "I'll talk to them," she said, voice flat with the weight of 100 other small fights she'd had with clipboard men. "Or you can just—" She didn't finish. It was the first time I realized how tired she was, not of me, but of being the one who kept the heat on while other people had feelings. After that, I worked like time owed me. Walt at the parts store taught me to gap spark plugs by feel, rolling the coin, size tool between thumb and forefinger until the drag was right. Change the condenser even if it looks fine. He said, eyes on a wall of belts. Some things die because they want to. I didn't tell him I'd started talking to the engine in the middle of the night. What do you want? I'd ask it, hand on the valve cover I'd sanded and painted a careful black, as if making it handsome might coax it into forgiveness. The second betrayal wasn't theft. It was thin walls. I sat on the back steps with a gas station sandwich and listened through the screen to Aunt Lena on the phone. He puts everything into that truck because it's easier than putting it into himself. She whispered, the kind of whisper that knows you can hear. Then, softer, he's not like Don. He won't quit if you humiliate him. He'll just get quieter. My anger didn't ignite. It drained like a lake in a wind, leaving rocks I hadn't known were there. Sunday morning, a tow truck backed into the drive with the inevitability of a bad dream. Neon vest, clipboard, a neighbor leaning on his fence, 2 kids on bikes, hungry for spectacle because spectacle is free. If it starts, it stays. The driver said, generous with 5 minutes he didn't owe me. Don hovered at the property line with his arms folded like a borrowed authority. I sat in the cab, the key ring biting my finger where I wrapped it tight, and slid the stamped F into the ignition. The first crank sounded like begging. The second cough was different fuel where there'd been only the idea. I pumped the pedal once, soft, the way Walt had taught me, and turned again. The engine caught on the third try like a match in wind. A choke, a bark, a low, stubborn rumble that climbed, fell, and found itself. The valve train clattered in the old way, hopeful and honest. The timing light I'd left on the radiator blinked approval. A cloud drifted from the tailpipe, and the smell was rich and right and full of 1,000 molecules making a single argument. It started. The older kid on the bike announced like news. The driver saluted me with his clipboard and left backward with the confidence of a man who knows his truck better than his boss. Aunt Lena cried on the porch with one hand to her mouth, like she didn't trust it. Don flushed pink and called it a temporary victory, the way people do when they're wrong in real time. I put my hand on the dash the way you congratulate a dog. I don't know whether I would have opened the glove box without the engine's vibration jiggling the latch like a small hand knocking. The door dropped with a sigh and breathed out paper and the ghost of pipe tobacco, how smell clings to wax and memory. A battered tobacco tin slid out and clinked against my thigh. Inside, a photograph of Grandpa and a younger Ellen, a parking ticket from 1985 with friendly warning, scribbled by a human who had a better day afterward, and an envelope sealed with brown tape, in case I forget, written in his machinist's careful hand. I broke the seal, and the sound it made felt like something being released. A stock certificate nested inside heavy paper with a wedding, invitation border, Breyer and Locke Tools, Incorporated. 10,000 common shares to Earl A. Ramsey, 1968. Stapled to it, a letter from a law firm dated 1999 explaining that Breyer and Locke had been acquired by Northline Defense and that this paper, a stray, unimmobilized certificate, could still be surrendered for Northline stock plus accumulated dividends. A number had been written in blue pen and circled in a hand I recognized from Christmas cards to the mayor. The second sheet was a codicil to his will, 1-page, notary seal, language simple as a clean cut. He left the truck to me and assigned the chose in action of any unclaimed certificate related to Breyer and Locke to me upon restoration of the vehicle to running condition. The third was a smaller note with my name. 4 lines, if you're reading this, she's running. A man ought to leave one thing better than he found it. I couldn't sell that paper, not after what it cost us. If you can make her run, you can't. Figure the rest. You don't often feel your life hinge. That afternoon I did. Past and present clicking together like the teeth on the key. He hadn't been sentimental about the truck. He'd been ashamed of the stock, ashamed that the company that fed him had laid off his men and paid him in paper like apology. And he couldn't bring himself to profit from it. But he couldn't throw it away either. So he put it where men with clean boots would never look. He made the inheritance contingent on me learning something he respected more than money. How to sit with a stubborn thing and make it tell you where it hurt. "What's that?" Don asked from the gravel, casual in the way a thief is casual if he thinks your back is turned. I climbed out with the engine idling and the envelope in my hand. Title, I said, which was and wasn't a lie. Aunt Lena came down the steps and held out her hand, no pretense. I showed her the codicil first. Her eyes tracked the notary seal like a compass finding north. I showed her the certificate, and she didn't understand the words, but she understood the weight of the paper and the letter stapled to it. When Don reached, she drew it back with a small motion that rearranged our whole family. Everything of Earl's is family. He tried. Old script, well rehearsed. We'll sort it later. I told him the law firm's name. It rearranged his face. They'll take your money and tell you what you want to hear, he said, because some men cannot imagine a world where weight isn't decided by volume. The next morning, I drove Ellen to the law office. The engine a steady hum that made the stoplights feel like applause. The receptionist looked at the certificate like it was a relic, and maybe it was. The attorney held it up to the light, smiled despite himself, and said the sentence that wrung my ribs. We've been hoping someone would walk in with this. Verification took weeks. There were signatures and affidavits, and a clerk at the courthouse who remembered Grandpa as the man with the flashlight, which made me picture him walking people to their cars when the lot lights went out, shining a circle ahead, saying nothing. Don filed an objection with a lawyer whose suit made him look rented. The judge read the codicil and the letter and listened to both sides describe the same landscape differently. She peered over her glasses at me and asked, "You started the truck?" I said yes. She smiled, just a fraction, like a person who remembers the sound of a stubborn engine giving in. She denied Don's petition and said, in more elegant words, to go home and stop wasting time that belonged to other people. Money changes a room even when it hasn't arrived yet. I didn't buy a new truck. I didn't buy a new house. I bought quiet, paid Aunt Lena's back taxes so letters stopped arriving with red ink, replaced the garage door so wind stopped arguing, bought a set of sockets that clicked into their tray with a sound that told me where things belonged. I registered Ellen properly and waited for plates with a patience I didn't know I possessed. When the transfer cleared, the number the attorney slid across the desk on a printout made me sit down before my knees made a decision without me. I sold half the stock, kept the rest, and had the certificate framed and locked in a safe because paper in a tin was romantic only until the roof leaked. Mara texted, "Coffee." The word hovered, bright and tempting and full of the energy of who we'd been before this part of me asked for all of me. I told her I hoped she'd bought the coat from the picture she sent, and that I was grateful for the time we'd had. I put the phone down and sat in the cab with the engine off, windows cracked, listening to the house breathe. On the passenger side, the sun painted a rectangle on the seat and warmed the torn vinyl. I ran my thumb over the groove in the steering wheel where Grandpa's ring had worn a divot over years of left turns, and I felt something like forgiveness come up in me. Not the big cinematic kind, just the daily kind, a decision you make each morning until it becomes who you are. The third betrayal arrived dressed like reconciliation. Blake showed up with a six-pack and an apology you could see in the way he practiced it on his walk up the drive. I took the cap, he said, eyes on his boots. Don told me to grab it so you'd quit. I felt sick about it. He waited for the fight, and when it didn't come, he looked confused. You might have saved me, I said, and his eyebrows climbed. Men who quit because a cap goes missing shouldn't be in charge of anything that matters. He swallowed, nodded too many times, and carried the six back to the fire pit where we talked about nothing that could hurt anyone for 2 hours. The real shift came slowly, the way Don sneaks into a room until you realize you can see the floor. We took Aunt Lena to the coast on a Saturday. The wind rattled the windows of the diner, and we ate chowder while gulls argued about something that hadn't happened yet. On the way home, we drove past the old factory Briar and Locke's bones made into storage units and a gym, and she pointed, quiet. He worked swing shift and still came to your school plays, she said, and then laughed at herself for the past tense like it needed permission. I started spending mornings doing small things that didn't look like money, tightening a loose hinge, sealing the crack where ants used to parade, oiling the squeak in the screen door that had been telling us it was alive for too long. Afternoons I drove the truck to places that held pieces of the story. Walt's parts counter, the courthouse clerk with the flashlight memory, the neighbor who leaned on his fence the day of the tow and grinned at me now when I rumbled by. I wrote a paragraph for a community college scholarship in Grandpa's name for machinists, and all it said was the line he'd given me. A man ought to leave one thing better than he found it. The dean called to ask if I wanted to add anything. I told him the line was enough. Some engines don't need more carburetor than the one they arrived with. Don stopped coming by. Holiday cards showed up with his wife's handwriting. Blake waved at me in the grocery aisle, a half-mile hanging like a jacket on a chair, unsure if I'd take it. The boys who'd sat on bikes at the curb grew into men who rolled their own trucks past mine and honked like we were members of a club that didn't require dues, only patience. Mrs. Whittaker from 2 houses down stopped one morning while I was hosing dust out of the garage and said, "Your grandfather would be proud," and then added, "Don't tell him I said that," as if he were still doing laps around the block, collecting compliments like mail. On the first warm day of spring, I took Ellen on the highway. 55 felt like the truth of her, not 65, not hurry. The wing windows threw the smell of pasture and sun, warmed asphalt into the cab. The engine settled into a conversation, low and willing. I touched the key on its ring with my thumb and felt the nicks and notches the way you feel a scar you've made peace with. Somewhere between exits I realized that the stock in the safe was a document with a number attached, but the note in my wallet. The folded, "If you're reading this, she's running," was the one that changed the temperature of the room when I opened it. On the back, in tiny letters I hadn't seen the first time, he'd written a single additional line, almost an afterthought. "If you figured this out, you know the difference between worth and price." They had laughed when I started. They had reasons. People always do. I spent nights alone in that garage, not because I was noble, but because stubbornness can be a raft if you keep it pointed at something worth crossing for. The day the engine caught, I understood the joke had never been on me. It had been a dare whispered by a man who couldn't say more than 4 lines on paper, and trusted me to hear the rest in the way a key turns when it finally finds home. When the glovebox fell open and the paper slid out with the weight of a story ready to be told, I understood another truth. Some documents are measured not only by what they can buy, but by what they prove about who you decided to be when nobody was clapping. So I keep turning the key, not out of fear the engine will die, but out of respect for the moment it chose to live. And every time it catches, the laughter that used to follow me home turns into a softer sound, like breath, like forgiveness, like the small click a lock makes right before it opens.